While checking the games of my students, I noticed a big flaw in the opening preparation of most of the white players on amateur level. So let me show you an interesting opening weapon for black against the white's first move, pawn to e4. This is Caro-Kann Defense, and even if you don't play it normally, I'm going to show you a really simple setup for black, which is going to work wonders for you. By the way, I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov from the Remote Chess Academy, and without further ado, let's get right into it. In the Caro-Kann Defense, there are a couple lines for white here. Most frequently, white plays either knight to c3 or pawn to e5, and the move pawn to e5 is actually the main line nowadays. The majority of the games exactly go into this closed variation. And in case white goes knight to c3, I'll show you a little later a really simple response for black right there. Anyway, in today's video we'll mostly talk about these closed line because again most players will play like this against you. And in this position the main move for black is bishop f5, and after that there is a lot of theory. But instead of that, I recommend that you play a more aggressive move, pawn to c5. The black's idea here in this opening is that you're kind of getting an improved version of the French defense, because you will play knight to c6, you'll put pressure on this white's pawn on d4, but your light squared bishop is still opened. It is not closed by the pawn as it happens in the French defense, and we'll later see how exactly you can play here as black. Now let me show you a really cool thing for you right here. This is a database of games on Lichess, and as you can see right here in the right corner, the most frequent response of white here is pawn to c3, which is actually completely wrong. Grandmasters would never play like this, or you would very rarely find them playing that move, which is just wrong and passive for white and gives black a great game, but you can see that it is by far the most played move. And I'm going to show you how you can take advantage of this. Okay, so your opponents will often play pawn to c3, and now you just go knight to c6, putting pressure onto this white central pawn on d4, and it's dangerous for white to trade on c5 at this point or in the future, because in this case, first of all, you can immediately take back this white's pawn on e5, and that pawn on c5 is also kind of weak, as you can play your pawn to e6, which would also open up the dark square bishop, which can grab this bishop on c5. Therefore, destroying the white center is a dangerous idea for white strategically, because they can lose all of their pawns there, and therefore very likely that they'll try to actually keep up that pawn on d4, and they'll play knight to f3. This enables your bishop to be developed to g4, to this great square where not only you can develop the bishop, but also you pin the knight, and you also influence this potential defender of the white's pawn on d4, so that anytime you want, you can just eliminate this defender. Here the most played move is bishop e2, you go pawn to e6, and if you know the French defense, you can see that the central pawn structure is similar, but unlike the French defense, you have your bishop out there on g4 instead of being totally locked on c8, and that is why I said earlier that you're kind of getting a much more improved version of the French defense as black. Now let's say white castles, and you go knight to e7. Your idea is to focus a lot of your forces against that white's pawn on d4, and it's actually in quite a big trouble. For example, if white plays bishop e3 trying to protect it, you go knight f5. That was the idea of this maneuver. Now the knight from f5 is hitting this pawn on d4 once again, and of course you can also take that bishop on e3 if you want to, but in the majority of the cases you'd prefer to win that pawn on d4. And here, funnily enough, most of the white players play the move pawn to h3, which is again completely wrong, and yet it is a most played move here. So also, just to answer some of the questions that you guys ask in comments, what if your opponent is a grandmaster, like really expert level player, he knows everything and he'll play better moves? Well, in that case, you'll get a normal game of chess. You will not win the game that easily. But what I'm showing to you is what happens most frequently in the games of players on amateur level, let's say 1500 rated players, and even for high rated opponents up to 2000 rating level, I'd say this will work just really great. Okay, so here you take on f3. Even though the move pawn to h3 is standard for white in general in a game of chess, but in this particular case, this exchange rather favors black, as anyway you are going to attack this pawn on d4, and anyway you are going to eliminate the defender of that pawn. So in this case, white playing pawn to h3 only helps you to realize your plan. And now you play queen to b6. That is another common move in this opening, so from here the queen also puts one more attack to this pawn on c5. And if you calculate the number of the black's pawns and pieces attacking that pawn, you see that it's just really critical and something that white cannot handle anymore. Black is ready to take on d4 and to win this pawn, and there is nothing white can do about that to protect it. And if they take on c5, trying to at least trade this pawn, now they break up their pawn structure in the center, and these pawns become weak. In addition to that, your queen from b6 not only puts pressure along this diagonal, but it also hits the pawn on b2, and now you can just grab it and also attack the rook. The only way for white to protect their rook from being captured is to develop their knight. Now you can grab the bishop on e3 to further break the white's pawn structure, and now all of the white's pawns right here are weak, and you're going to collect them one after another. For example, queen takes c3. If they protect that pawn, then bishop takes c5, and now this pawn is weak, this pawn can be captured, and then you castle, you grab all these pawns, and you're just getting a winning position. Now let me show you another line which is possible in this variation of the Caro-Kann defense. By the way, recently I recorded a video about a 9-year-old girl making a draw against Garry Kasparov playing this position as black, so you may wish to check this out and learn a couple of new ideas about this setup. I'll link it down below. So far, we've been talking about the move pawn to c5, attacking the white center right away, and in the previous example we checked the move pawn to c3, which is passive. White is trying to hold their center, but very often they fail to do so. That is why a better idea for white is just take on c5 right away, as they cannot hold that pawn anyway. Now black goes knight to c6, putting pressure on this pawn, so white protects it. Then once again you go bishop g4. You can see the similarity between these two lines, as overall the position is more or less the same. Let's say white goes bishop e2, and now we play pawn to e6. It is very good, once again, to remember this idea that first you bring the bishop out to g4, and after that you fix the position in the center by playing pawn to e6. Now you're completely solid here, there is nothing white can do against you to attack you, and your bishop is completely active there, it's not restricted by your central pawns. Okay, let's see what white can do now. You've got a lot of threats here actually, as you're attacking both of the pawns. You're attacking the pawn here on c5, as well as attacking the pawn on e5, because anytime you want, you can trade off this knight on f3 and then grab the pawn on e5, which will no longer be defended. That is why white realizes that they cannot hold both of their pawns, and let's say they go bishop f4. In this case, you take back the pawn on c5, let's say white castles, and in this case, since white traded off their pawn on d4, you switch your attack against another pawn of white in the center, against the pawn on e5. And here you can choose a little bit slower approach. You can bring your knight out to e7 and g6, and from there it will attack the bishop as well as the pawn. It is also a very good maneuver for black, very common in this line. But in this case, you may opt for a more direct approach and just right away grab the pawn. So you take first the knight and then you go bishop d4, a very sudden attacking move. And from here, the bishop attacks this pawn on e5 together with the knight, but also it attacks the pawn on b2. And therefore, white is already defenseless, and you will inevitably grab one of their pawns, preferably that pawn on e5, getting a draw advantage, getting a great position. If you wish to, you may actually still increase the pressure onto this pawn on e5 by playing queen to c7, so it can attack the pawn, or your knight can go out and attack the pawn from here. But again, in the current case, it's not even necessary, as you just win it for nothing right on the next move. Now let me also show you a couple of common traps here that white player can set up for you. So obviously you gotta be prepared. In this case, let's say white goes into the line which we analyzed previously. They take the pawn, here we go knight to c6, they play knight f3, bishop g4, and even though it looks like you're threatening this pawn because of the pin, white player may pretend like they overlooked your threat and just play some neutral moves such as pawn to c3. And in this case, you think, okay, I can grab this pawn, but that was a trap set by white earlier. In this case, it does not win the pawn really, because white has a really strong response, knight takes e5, temporarily sacrificing their queen, but on the next move they go bishop b5 check. The only way to cover your king is by the queen, so you have to give your queen away. And now on the next move, while grab your bishop on d1, thus getting two extra minor pieces and a totally winning position. So that is one of the traps that you gotta be aware of. I just took a couple moves back before black played that wrong move, knight takes e5. Of course, there is nothing dangerous in white playing pawn to c3, it's just that you don't need to get trapped like that. Instead, you just play pawn to e6. As always, after you develop your bishop to g4, it's very usual thing for you to play pawn to e6 on the next move. In the vast majority of the cases, you gotta do just that. In this case, you opened up your dark squared bishop, attacking this pawn, and still, of course, the white's pawn on e5 is somewhat in danger. In this case, white has one more trap that you need to know. White may play bishop e3, once again pretending like they overlooked your threat of knight takes e5. But you still should not take this poisoned pawn right now, because in this case, white has the move queen to a4, which actually wins the game. What's the trick here? White removed their queen from this pin with a tempo. That's the trick. So on the next move, they're ready to grab your knight, because it is checked to your king, so you have to do something about your king, and then white is ready to grab your knight. And if you cover the king by the knight, then white would grab the bishop right here on g4, which is no longer defended. So that's another trap that you need to know. By the way, let's test your calculation skills. Let's take a move back here. What if black goes queen to d7? Does it save black or not? Please think about it. What is the right move for white here? And write it down in the comments below. Let's see if you can crack this puzzle. I've just shown you the wrong move for black, which is taken on e5 immediately. But what is the right move? Well, there are many ways for black. One of the interesting lines is to play pawn to a6 to prevent any kind of problems along this diagonal. And after that, you are truly ready to grab that pawn on e5 on the next move, unless white does something about that. And the only thing white can possibly do to hold that pawn is to play bishop d4. And in this case, you can gradually and methodically destroy all of the white's position. You first of all eliminate this defender, and then you play pawn to b6, undermining this pawn, threatening to just grab it, so white has to take. Now you take that bishop on d4, and finally you take with the queen the pawn on b6. And as a result of this forcing line, now white has a whole lot of these weaknesses, and you will inevitably start grabbing all of the white's pawns one by one. And after you grab the pawn on d4, the white's pawn on e5 will become the new target. There is nothing white can do right now to protect their pawns. The only way to possibly protect both of the pawns is to play queen c3, but it fails due to bishop b4, in this case winning the queen thanks to this pin. Now let me show you real quick what you can do in case white goes knight c3, another way, not pawn to e5 but knight to c3. In this case, the simplest way that you can go for is to take there and play knight to f6. That's the line that really does not require from you anything, because after the exchange you take with a pawn and then you play bishop d6 and you castle, and the black's next moves are so simple that you can play it without knowing anything about this line. Let's say white plays anything, you go bishop d6, then you castle, after that you develop your bishop to g4, on the next move you play knight to d7, you'll probably place your rook to e8. The black's moves are just so simple and natural that you can play it without any previous experience of this opening. Of course, it's a very brief summary. I cannot explain everything about the opening within one short video, but anyway, it's enough for you to get started and to start playing it with good results. By the way, if you want to learn more about the Caro-Kann Defense, then you can kind of vote for that, give a like to this video, and if it gets 1000 likes, I'll know that you guys are interested and I will record a continuation. Meanwhile, you may check out my free masterclass, The Best Way to Improve at Chess Instantly, by clicking the link on the screen or down below in the description. I hope that you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.